What would you do if a stranger offered you everything you needed, but the price was a lie you'd have to live every single day? The night Caleb Harding knocked on my door wasn't the night my life changed. It was the night I realized my old life had already ended, and I just hadn't noticed yet. Let me tell you how a desperate rancher and a broken widow became the most unexpected love story in Flint Creek, Kansas. I remember the exact moment I first saw her. It was a cold October evening in 1895. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you pile on. The kind that makes you question why your grandfather ever decided to settle in Kansas when there were perfectly good farms in warmer places. The wind had teeth that night, biting through my coat as I tied my horse outside Miller's General Store. I'd ridden into town for supplies I didn't really need, just to escape the silence of my farmhouse for a few hours. 3 years of living alone had made me strange about silence. Sometimes I craved it like a dying man craves water. Other times, it pressed against me like a weight on my chest, and I'd do anything to hear another human voice, even if it was just old Miller complaining about the price of grain. The widow McAllister's boarding house glowed warm against the darkening sky, windows lit with kerosene lamps that cast long rectangles of gold onto the wooden sidewalk. I wasn't planning to stop. I had no business there. But something made me pause, made me look up at that window on the second floor. And that's when I saw her. She was carrying a stack of linens taller than her head, her small frame struggling under the weight. A strand of dark hair had escaped her bun, falling across her cheek like a brush stroke of ink on porcelain, and she blew at it impatiently as she climbed the stairs. Her dress was plain grey, practical, and worn at the elbows, but she moved with a grace that made me think of the wild deer that sometimes wandered onto my property at dawn. Something about the determined set of her jaw, the way she refused to ask for help even when she clearly needed it, made me stop in my tracks. I stood there like a fool, my hand frozen on my horse's bridle, staring at a stranger through a window, like I'd never seen a woman before in my life. "That's the new widow," old Tom Fletcher said beside me, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I hadn't even noticed him approach. He was grinning at me with the knowing look of a man who'd seen his share of love-struck fools. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that I wasn't struck by anything except the cold, but the words wouldn't come. "Clara Whitmore," he continued, following my gaze back to the window. "Husband died 6 months back, owing half the county. Debts piled up higher than a man's head. She sold everything she had to pay what she could, but it wasn't enough. Now she's working off the rest at McAllister's place." I grunted, not trusting myself to speak. I was a man of few words on the best of days, and that night, watching her disappear up those stairs, I couldn't have strung together a sentence if my life depended on it. Which, as it turned out, it soon would. My name is Caleb Harding, and I am not an easy man to know. I stand 6 feet and 6 inches tall, with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway and hands that have broken both soil and bone. My arms are thick as most men's thighs, built by years of hauling wheat and splitting wood and wrestling stubborn plows through reluctant earth. When I walk into a room, people step back. When I speak, they listen. Not because they respect me, necessarily, but because they're afraid of what might happen if they don't. My face isn't one that puts people at ease. A scar runs from my left temple to my jaw. A jagged white line against sun-darkened skin, courtesy of a horse that spooked wrong when I was 17. The horse had been frightened by a rattlesnake, and when it reared, its hoof caught me across the face. I'd bled so much my mother thought I was dying. Sometimes, looking in the mirror, I still think part of me did. My eyes are the color of storm clouds, and I've been told they hold about as much warmth. I don't smile often, I don't know how. My father was the same way, and his father before him. We Harding men are built for work, not for charm. I inherited my father's land 3 years ago, along with his stubbornness and his enemies. 2,000 acres of the finest wheat-growing soil in Kansas, stretching from the Cottonwood River to the edge of the Flint Hills, and every inch of it contested by my cousins Marcus and Elijah Harding, who believed the land should have been theirs. They weren't entirely wrong to want it. My father, Josiah Harding, had been the eldest of 3 brothers. When his brothers died, one from influenza and one from a farming accident, their sons had expected to inherit something. It was the way things were done. Family took care of family. But my father's will had been clear, written in his own hand and witnessed by the town's most respected lawyer. Everything went to me, his only child, on one condition. I had to be married by my 35th birthday. I'd laughed when the lawyer read that part, a dry, bitter sound that echoed off the walls of his cramped office. My father, the man who'd barely spoken to my mother for the last decade of her life, the man who'd shown me nothing but coldness and criticism for as long as I could remember, wanted me to find a wife. He wanted me to build a family, to create the warmth he'd never been able to create himself. The irony wasn't lost on me, neither was the cruelty. My father had known exactly what he was doing. He'd known that a man like me, scarred and silent and strange, would struggle to find a woman willing to share his life. He'd known that my cousins would circle like vultures, waiting for me to fail. He'd given me an impossible task, and if I failed, everything my family had built for 3 generations would go to men who'd done nothing to earn it. But I'd had 3 years. Plenty of time, I'd thought. I'd thought wrong. The first year, I'd been too busy saving the farm to think about marriage. My father had let things go badly in his final months, and there was work enough for 3 men, let alone 1. I'd labored from before dawn until after dark, falling into bed so exhausted I couldn't dream. The second year, I'd made some half-hearted attempts. I'd gone to the church socials, stood against the wall like the giant I was, and watched the women my age dance with men who knew how to smile. A few widows had shown interest, but their eyes had been on the land, not on me. I'd scared off the rest. The third year, I'd given up. I'd told myself I didn't need a wife, that I could find some way around my father's will, some legal trick that would let me keep what was mine without playing his games. But the lawyers had been clear. The will was ironclad. If I wasn't married by midnight on my 35th birthday, the land would pass to my cousins automatically. No exceptions, no extensions, no mercy. My 35th birthday was exactly 6 weeks away, and my cousins knew it. 6 weeks, Caleb, Marcus had said the day before, his thin lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. He was a small man, my cousin Marcus, with the pinched face of a rat and the cold eyes of a snake. He'd hated me since we were children, since the day my father chose to train me instead of him, since every moment I'd lived up to expectations he could never meet. 6 weeks, and that land becomes ours, legally, rightfully. There's nothing rightful about it, I'd growled, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. The law says otherwise. Elijah had stepped forward, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip in a way that was meant to look casual and didn't. He was bigger than Marcus, built like a bull, but he had his brother's cunning and his brother's cruelty. Course, you could save us all the trouble and sign it over now. Accidents happen on farms, especially to men who live alone. I'd told them to get off my property. They'd left laughing, their horses kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the air long after they'd disappeared. That night, lying in my empty bed, staring at the ceiling I'd helped my father build when I was just a boy, I made a decision. I would not lose this land. Not to them, not to anyone. I just needed a wife, and I needed one fast. The next morning, I found myself standing outside the widow McAllister's boarding house, my hat in my hands, feeling more foolish than I had in my entire life. My heart was hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape. My palms were sweating despite the cold. I hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, had barely been able to think about anything except what I was about to do. I was about to propose marriage to a woman I'd never spoken to. A woman who didn't know my name, didn't know my face, didn't know anything about me except what the town's gossips had told her. And the town's gossips had never been kind to the Harding men. She had every reason to say no. She had every reason to run screaming in the opposite direction. But I'd seen something in her eyes through that window, a determination, a refusal to give up even when everything was against her. I recognized it because I felt it in myself. Maybe that would be enough. Mrs. McAllister answered my knock with suspicious eyes. She was a stout woman in her 60s, with iron-gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to lift her eyebrows into a permanent expression of skepticism. She'd been running this boarding house for 30 years, protecting her boarders like a hen with her chicks, and she'd seen every kind of man come through her door. "Mr. Harding," she said, her tone making it clear she knew exactly who I was and wasn't impressed. "What brings you here at this hour?" It was barely past dawn. The sun was just beginning to climb over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that I would have appreciated if I hadn't been so terrified. "I need to speak with Mrs. Whitmore," I said, impressed that my voice came out steady. "It's a business matter." Her eyes narrowed further, creasing the skin around them into a map of suspicion. "What kind of business would a man like you have with a widow working off her husband's debts? The kind that might clear those debts entirely." That got her attention. Her eyebrows, already impossibly high, climbed even higher. She stepped aside, though reluctantly, and pointed toward a small parlor off the main hall. "Wait there. I'll fetch her. But I'll be watching, Mr. Harding. I'll be watching close." I nodded and walked into the parlor, turning my hat around and around in my hands, trying to rehearse what I would say. Nothing sounded right. Nothing sounded sane. I was about to ask a stranger to marry me because my dead father had decided to control my life from beyond the grave. If she said no, I might lose everything my family had built for 3 generations. If she said yes, I would be bound to a woman I didn't know. A woman who might hate me. A woman who would only be with me because she had no other choice. Neither option seemed good, but one seemed slightly less terrible than the other. The door opened, and there she was. She was smaller than I'd realized from the window, barely reaching my chest if she stood on her toes. Her hair was that deep brown that looks black in shadow and red in sunlight, pulled back severely from a face that was all sharp angles and tired eyes. The exhaustion was etched into her features like words carved into stone, the kind of weariness that sleep couldn't touch. She wore a simple grey dress, practical and worn, with patches at the elbows that had been sewn with small, careful stitches. Her hands were red and rough from work, the nails trimmed short, the knuckles slightly swollen. These were not the hands of a pampered woman. These were the hands of someone who had learned to survive. But her eyes, those eyes held a fire that all her hardship hadn't managed to extinguish. They were the color of honey in sunlight, warm and golden, and when they met mine, I felt something shift in my chest. Something I couldn't name. Something I didn't want to examine too closely. "Mr. Harding," she said, her voice cautious but not afraid. She didn't flinch at the sight of me, didn't step back, didn't look away. "Mrs. McAllister said you wanted to discuss business." "I do." I gestured to the chair across from me, trying to make my massive frame seem less threatening. "Please, sit." She sat, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap like a schoolgirl waiting for a lesson. Waiting, watching me with those careful, measuring eyes. I took a deep breath. I'd never been good with words, not like my father, who could talk a man into selling his own horse and convince him it was his idea. I'd always been better with actions, with work, with silence. But silence wouldn't save me now. I decided to just say it. Mrs. Whitmore, I need a wife. You need money. I'm proposing a business arrangement that would benefit us both. Her eyes widened, and the honey gold seemed to darken with shock. Then, to my surprise, she laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, more startled than amused, like a bird taking sudden flight. You're proposing marriage? To me? She shook her head, a strand of dark hair coming loose to fall across her cheek. We've never even met. I don't know your first name. Caleb, I said. My name is Caleb. Caleb. She repeated it slowly, as if testing the weight of it on her tongue. Well, Caleb, I appreciate the directness, but surely you understand how insane this sounds. I know how it sounds. It sounds like the ramblings of a madman. It probably is. I met her eyes directly, letting her see the desperation I'd been trying to hide. I was tired of pretending, tired of acting like I had everything under control when my whole world was crumbling around me. But I'm running out of options, Mrs. Whitmore, and I thought maybe you were too. The laughter died in her eyes. Something shifted in her expression, a crack in the wall of skepticism she'd built around herself. She looked down at her work-roughened hands, turning them over, as if seeing them for the first time. When she looked up again, her expression was wary, but no longer dismissive. Tell me everything, she said. Start from the beginning. So I did. I told her about my father's will, about the clause that required me to be married by my 35th birthday. I told her about Marcus and Elijah, about their threats, about the way they'd been circling my land like wolves waiting for a wounded deer to fall. I told her about the 2,000 acres that had been in my family for 3 generations, about the blood and sweat and sacrifice that had gone into every inch of it, about what I stood to lose. I told her I wasn't asking for a real marriage, just a legal one, just long enough to satisfy the terms of the will and secure my claim to the land. After that, I said, leaning forward in my chair, you'd be free to go. I'd pay off your husband's debts, every penny of them. I'd give you enough money to start over somewhere new, anywhere you want, and we'd go our separate ways. No one has to know it wasn't real. She was quiet for a long time. I could see her thinking, weighing the risks against the rewards, trying to find the catch. I didn't blame her. If someone had made this offer to me, I'd have been looking for the catch too. Your cousins, she said finally, her voice low and thoughtful. You said they threatened you. Would they threaten me too? I wanted to lie, wanted to tell her she'd be perfectly safe, that nothing bad could possibly happen. But I'd already decided to be honest with her. She deserved that much. They might try, I admitted. Marcus and Elijah aren't the kind of men who give up easily. They've been waiting for this land their whole lives. They won't like it when they find out I've married. So I could be in danger. You could be. I held her gaze, letting her see the steel in my eyes. But I would never let anyone hurt you. I would protect you with everything I have, everything I am. That's not what I asked. I felt a flicker of respect. Most people were too intimidated by my size to push back against me. She wasn't. She was smaller than half the men I knew, but she had more backbone than any of them. No, I acknowledged. It's not what you asked, but it's the truth. I've been protecting this land my whole life. I know how to protect what's mine. Something flickered in her eyes at that last word. What's yours? I realized what I'd said, how it sounded. I felt heat rise to my face, which almost never happened. I'd spent decades mastering the art of the blank expression, and this small woman had undone me in minutes. I meant the arrangement, the agreement. I would protect our agreement. She studied me for another long moment, and I had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see right through me. that she knew I was already thinking of her as more than a business partner, even though I'd only known her for half an hour. "I have conditions," she said. My heart, which had been sinking, suddenly rose. She wasn't saying no. She was negotiating. That was something. That was hope. "Name them. Separate bedrooms, always. I will not share your bed unless and until I choose to, and I may never choose to. Is that understood?" "Perfectly." I nodded, trying to ignore the flash of disappointment that went through me. This was a business arrangement. I had no right to disappointment. "You'll have your own room, your own space. I won't enter without your permission. Second, I keep working. I don't care how much money you have or how big your farm is. I won't be kept like some kind of decoration or pet. I need to be useful." "The farm always needs hands," I said. "There's work enough for 10 people, and it's just been me. You can work as much or as little as you like, whatever makes you comfortable. Third." She paused, and I saw a flicker of vulnerability beneath the steel. "If I decide to leave before the arrangement is complete, if something happens and I can't stay, what then?" This was the part I dreaded, the part where I had to admit how much power she would have over me once we were married. "If you leave before the will is satisfied," I said slowly, "I lose everything. The land goes to Marcus and Elijah. Everything my family built disappears." I swallowed hard. "I'd ask that you stay at least until my birthday passes and the land is legally mine." 6 weeks. "After that, you're free to go whenever you want. I'll hold up my end of the bargain regardless. And if something happens to you before then? If your cousins—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. "Then you inherit half of everything," I said. "I'll have the lawyer draw it up. If I die before my birthday, you get the land, the house, all of it. You won't have risked your reputation for nothing." She blinked, clearly surprised. "You'd trust me with that? A woman you just met?" "You're the only one I can trust with it, because you have nothing to gain from my death except what I freely give you. My cousins would gain everything." She was quiet again, but this time I could see she was seriously considering it. I held my breath, waiting. The clock on the mantel ticked away the seconds, each one louder than the last. "One more condition," she said finally. "Anything. If this becomes real—" She hesitated, her golden eyes searching my face. "If either of us starts to feel things that weren't part of the bargain, we tell each other. Honestly. Immediately. No games, no pretending, no hoping the other person will figure it out. I've already lost one husband." Her voice cracked slightly, and I saw the ghost of pain flash across her features. I won't lose myself to another man's silence. I didn't fully understand what she meant. Not then. But I heard the hurt in her voice, and I made a silent promise to myself that I would never add to it. "You have my word." She stood, and for a moment we just looked at each other across the small parlor, this giant of a man and this slip of a woman, about to bind their lives together for reasons that had nothing to do with love. Then she held out her hand, small and work-worn and steady as a rock. "Then I'll do it, Mr. Harding. I'll pretend to be your wife." I took her hand in mine, feeling how delicate her bones were compared to my massive grip, how easy it would be to hurt her without meaning to. I held her fingers gently, like they were made of spun glass. "Caleb," I said, "if you're going to marry me, you should probably call me Caleb." The ghost of a smile crossed her lips. "Caleb, then." We shook on it, and I wondered what I'd just gotten us both into. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparations. I met with the lawyer to draw up the papers Clara had requested, making sure she would be protected no matter what happened to me. I spread the word around town that I was getting married, and watched the gossip spread like wildfire through dry grass. I cleaned my house for the first time in months, scrubbing floors and washing windows and trying to make the place look less like the den of a wild animal and more like a home. Clara, for her part, settled her affairs at the boarding house. Mrs. McAllister was not pleased. She cornered me on the second day and told me in no uncertain terms that if I hurt Clara in any way, she would personally see to it that I regretted it. "I don't know what you're playing at, Caleb Harding," she said, her eyes sharp as knife blades. "But that girl has been through enough. She doesn't need a man like you adding to her troubles." "I don't intend to add to her troubles, ma'am," I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. "I intend to end them." She studied me for a long moment, looking for the lie. Whatever she saw in my face must have satisfied her, because she finally nodded. "See that you do." We were married on a grey Thursday afternoon in the tiny church at the edge of town. The building was barely big enough to hold 20 people, with narrow wooden pews and a stained glass window that depicted a shepherd watching over his flock. Pastor Williams presided, his brow furrowed, with something that might have been confusion or concern or both. Mrs. McAllister and old Tom Fletcher served as witnesses. Tom grinned at me like he'd won a bet with someone. Mrs. McAllister watched with the sharp eyes of a hawk, ready to swoop down at the first sign of trouble. Clara wore a cream-coloured dress that Mrs. McAllister had unearthed from somewhere. The lace yellowed with age, but still beautiful. Her hair was piled on top of her head in an elaborate arrangement that must have taken hours, a few soft curls framing her face. She carried a handful of wildflowers I'd picked that morning, without really knowing why, purple asters and goldenrod, the last blooms before winter set in. She looked beautiful. Beautiful and terrified and determined, all at once. I was probably the same, though I was better at hiding it. When the preacher asked if anyone objected to our union, I half expected Marcus and Elijah to burst through the doors. They didn't. The church remained quiet. Nothing but the sound of wind rattling the windows and Tom Fletcher clearing his throat. "I do," Clara said when it was her turn, and her voice was steady as the stone walls around us. "I do," I echoed, and I meant more by those words than I could admit even to myself. Pastor Williams pronounced us man and wife, and when he said I could kiss my bride, I hesitated. This wasn't part of our agreement. I hadn't asked permission. But Clara looked up at me with those honey-gold eyes, and I saw something there that might have been permission, might have been curiosity, might have been something else entirely. I bent down and brushed my lips against hers, gentle as I could manage, quick enough to be proper. Her lips were soft, and she tasted faintly of the tea she'd had that morning. The contact lasted less than a second, but it burned itself into my memory like a brand. When I straightened, her cheeks were flushed pink. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than fear. I felt hope. The ride back to the farm was quiet, the wagon wheels creaking over the rutted road, the horse plodding along at its own pace. Clara sat beside me on the wagon seat, her new ring catching the afternoon light every time she moved her hand. She kept looking at it, turning her hand this way and that, like she couldn't quite believe it was real. I kept stealing glances at her, trying to read her face, but she gave nothing away. Her expression was calm, composed, the face of a woman who had learned to hide her feelings from the world. I wondered what her first husband had been like. What kind of man had made her so careful, so guarded? I wondered if she had loved him, and if she had, what that love had felt like. I wondered if she would ever feel anything for me. "It's bigger than I expected," she said when the farmhouse came into view, and I started slightly, pulled from my thoughts. The house rose up against the grey sky, 2 stories of weathered wood and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and side. Smoke was rising from the chimney. I'd banked the fire before I left that morning, wanting the house to be warm when we arrived. My grandfather built the original structure, I said. Just 2 rooms then. My father added the second floor when I was born, and I've been maintaining it. Maintaining, she repeated, a note of amusement in her voice. It looks like more than maintaining. She was right. The house was well kept, perhaps obsessively so. I'd spent countless hours repairing shingles, replacing boards, painting trim. It was too big for one man, too empty, but I'd always known that. I'd just never been willing to share it. Until now. There are 4 bedrooms upstairs, I said as I helped her down from the wagon. My hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary, feeling how light she was, how easily I could lift her. You can have whichever one you want. I've been using the one at the end of the hall, so maybe one of the others. The one farthest from yours? I felt my face heat again. I just meant you should have your choice. The ghost of a smile crossed her lips. The same smile I'd seen in the parlor 3 days ago. I'm teasing you, Caleb. I didn't know what to say to that. No one had teased me in years, maybe ever. Let me show you the house, I said instead, and she followed me up the porch steps and through the front door. I watched her face as she took in the interior. The front parlor with its stone fireplace and faded rugs. The kitchen with its cast-iron stove and worn wooden table. The narrow stairs leading up to the second floor, the walls hung with photographs of people long dead. She didn't say anything, just looked and looked, her golden eyes taking in every detail. I tried to see the house through her eyes, the dust I'd missed in the corners, the curtain that hung slightly crooked, the emptiness that no amount of furniture could fill. It's a good house, she said finally, solid, well built. Lonely, I admitted before I could stop myself. She looked at me then, really looked, and something in her expression softened. Lonely, she agreed. But maybe that can change. I showed her the rest of the house, the bedrooms upstairs, the small bathroom with the copper tub I'd hauled all the way from Wichita, the linen closet stocked with quilts my mother had made before she died. She chose the bedroom across from mine, not the one at the end of the hall, and I tried not to read too much into that. I'll let you settle in, I said, suddenly awkward again. I need to check on the animals. Dinner's usually around 6, but I can push it later if you need more time. 6 is fine. She paused in the doorway of her new room, the afternoon light catching the gold in her hair. Caleb? Yes? Thank you for all of this. I know it's not. She hesitated, searching for the right words. I know it's not what either of us would have chosen, but thank you for choosing me. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and escaped to the barn before I could say something foolish. The first weeks of our arrangement were awkward in ways I hadn't anticipated. Clara, true to her word, threw herself into work. She cleaned rooms that hadn't been touched since my mother died, scrubbing floors and washing windows until they gleamed. She organized my pantry, which had devolved into a chaos of mismatched jars and mysterious packages. She fixed the curtain that had been hanging crooked for 3 years, mended the tear in the kitchen tablecloth, and somehow convinced my bad-tempered rooster, the one I'd been considering for the stew pot, to stop attacking anyone who entered the yard. I watched her transform my house into a home, and I didn't know how to feel about it. I wasn't used to having someone else in my space. The sounds of another person moving through the rooms, footsteps on the floorboards, the creak of doors opening and closing, the smell of real cooking instead of my own burned attempts, roast chicken and fresh bread and pies that made my mouth water just thinking about them. The simple fact of not being alone for the first time in 3 years. It should have been uncomfortable. It should have made me feel invaded, intruded upon. I valued my privacy. I guarded my solitude like a dragon hoarding gold. Instead, I found myself listening for her footsteps every morning, disappointed when I rose before her, and the house was still silent. I found myself looking forward to meals we shared, even though we ate mostly in awkward silence, neither of us knowing what to say. I found myself noticing things about her, the way she hummed when she washed dishes, a soft tune I didn't recognize but couldn't get out of my head. The way she bit her lip when she was concentrating, her brow furrowed in thought. The way she laughed when the cat did something absurd, a genuine laugh that seemed to surprise even her. I was cataloging every detail like a man memorizing a map, like a man who knew he would need to find his way back to something. I was in trouble. By the second week, I'd accepted the truth. I was falling for my pretend wife. Every day brought new revelations. She was kind to the animals, in a way that suggested she'd grown up with them. She had a sharp sense of humor that emerged when she was comfortable, catching me off guard with observations that made me want to laugh out loud. She read in the evenings, curled up in the chair by the fire, her lips moving slightly as she followed the words on the page. She was beautiful in ways I hadn't expected. Not just her face, though I found that increasingly difficult to look away from, but the way she moved, graceful and efficient. The way she met my eyes without flinching, without the fear I usually saw in people who looked at me. The way she treated me like a man instead of a monster. I'd told myself this would be simple. A business arrangement, a temporary solution to a permanent problem. I told myself I could share my house with a beautiful woman for 6 weeks without feeling anything more than gratitude for her help. I was the biggest fool in Kansas. I started finding excuses to be in the house during the day, repairs that needed doing, questions about dinner. Once, I walked all the way back from the far fields just to ask her if she'd seen my hammer, which I'd left in the barn and knew perfectly well exactly where it was. She didn't seem to mind. Sometimes I caught her looking at me when she thought I wasn't paying attention, her golden eyes thoughtful, speculative. I didn't know what to make of that look. I was afraid to hope. We developed a routine, breakfast together in the grey light of dawn, usually in companionable silence. Then I'd head out to the fields, and she'd turn to whatever domestic project she'd undertaken that day. Midday, she'd bring me lunch wherever I was working, and we'd eat together under the wide Kansas sky. Dinner was the longest meal, as the nights grew colder and the darkness came earlier, and sometimes we'd sit by the fire afterward, her reading and me pretending not to watch her. It was the closest thing to contentment I'd felt in years, but the peace couldn't last. I should have known that. It was late October when the first incident happened. I was in the barn, repairing a broken plow blade, my hands black with grease and my mind pleasantly empty. The work was simple, repetitive, the kind of task that let me think without really thinking. I was reflecting on nothing in particular, certainly not on the way Clara's hair looked in the morning light, when I heard her scream. I don't remember dropping my tools. I don't remember running across the yard. I don't remember throwing open the kitchen door hard enough to crack the frame. I just remember bursting into the house, my heart pounding so hard it hurt, my hands already clenched into fists, ready to kill whoever had touched her. She was backed against the wall, a broom in her hands, held out in front of her like a weapon. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, her whole body trembling. And on the floor between us was a snake. It was just a garter snake, harmless, barely 2 feet long. More scared of her than she was of it, if that was possible. It was trying to slither away, looking for an escape route, probably wondering how it had ended up in this warm house when it should have been finding somewhere to hibernate for winter. I crossed the room in 2 strides, scooped up the snake with my bare hands, and tossed it gently out the open window. Then I turned to her. "You're safe," I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite the adrenaline still coursing through me. It was just a garter snake. They're not dangerous. They eat mice, mostly. Probably came inside looking for warmth. "I know that," she said, her voice shaking despite her attempt at control. "I know that logically, but I've been terrified of snakes since I was a child. Logic doesn't seem to help when there's one in your kitchen, staring at you like it's deciding whether you'd make a good meal. Despite myself, I felt the corner of my mouth twitch. Garter snakes don't eat people. Tell that to my pounding heart. I should have stepped back. Should have given her space to compose herself, to gather the dignity she clearly valued. We had an arrangement. We had boundaries. I was supposed to respect them. Instead, I found myself moving closer. My hand reached out of its own accord, coming to rest on her shoulder. "You're shaking." "I'm fine." But she was still trembling, little shivers running through her whole body. "You're not fine." Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Neither of us breathed. Then, slowly, carefully, as if approaching a wild animal that might startle, I pulled her into my arms. She was stiff at first, surprised by the contact. I held still, letting her adjust, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. But after a moment, her body relaxed against mine, and her hands came up to rest on my chest. I could feel her heart pounding, gradually slowing. I could feel the warmth of her breath through my shirt. I could feel myself falling and falling and falling. "Thank you," she whispered against my chest. "It was just a snake." My voice came out rough, barely above a growl. She pulled back enough to look at me, and there was something new in her eyes, something that made my breath catch, made my heart stutter in my chest. "Not for the snake," she said softly, "for making me feel safe. I haven't felt safe in a very long time." I wanted to kiss her. The urge was so strong, it physically hurt to hold back. My whole body ached with the need to close the distance between us, to claim her mouth, to show her without words what she was beginning to mean to me. But I remembered our agreement. Separate bedrooms, no games, no pretending. If either of us started to feel things that weren't part of the bargain, we would tell each other honestly. I wasn't ready for that conversation, wasn't ready to risk the fragile peace we'd built. So I stepped back, clearing my throat, and mumbled something about checking the barn for more snakes, for holes they might be getting in through. She nodded, something flickering in her eyes that might have been disappointment, and we went back to our careful, distant routine. But something had changed. We both knew it. I caught her looking at me differently after that day. Longer glances across the dinner table, her eyes lingering on my face, on my hands. A smile that reached her eyes when I came in from the fields. A smile that made my heart do strange things. She started making my favorite foods without asking what they were, as if she'd been paying attention all along. And I was paying attention too. More than I should have been. I noticed that she talked in her sleep sometimes, soft murmurs I could hear through the wall between our rooms. I noticed that she was ticklish behind her left knee, because she jumped and laughed when the barn cat brushed against her there. I noticed that she had a small birthmark on her left wrist, shaped like a crescent moon, that she touched absently when she was thinking hard about something. I started checking on her each night before I went to my own room, just to make sure she was all right. Just to make sure the lamp was out, that she hadn't fallen asleep reading again. Just to see her face, peaceful in sleep, the worry lines smoothed away. I never entered her room, never touched her, just stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her breathe, and feeling things I had no right to feel. I was in trouble. Deep, dangerous, wonderful trouble. The letters from Marcus started arriving in November. They were addressed to Clara, not to me, and that was the first sign that my cousins were planning something more sophisticated than their usual threats. They were trying to get to me through her, trying to drive a wedge between us, trying to scare her away before my birthday arrived. The first letter came on a grey morning, delivered with the usual mail. Clara brought it to me at breakfast. Her forehead creased with confusion. "This is for me," she said. "But I don't know anyone in Kansas besides you. Who's Marcus Harding?" I felt my stomach drop. My cousin. You don't have to read that. I want to know what I'm dealing with." So she read it, right there at the breakfast table, her eyes moving over the words. I watched her face, looking for fear, for doubt. For the moment, she would decide this arrangement wasn't worth the trouble. Instead, I saw anger. "He's claiming you killed your own father." She looked up at me, her golden eyes blazing. "That's absurd. Everyone knows your father died of a heart attack." "Everyone knows what the doctor said." I kept my voice neutral, controlled. "Marcus is implying the doctor was paid off, or that I somehow induced the heart attack. He doesn't need to prove anything, just plant enough doubt to make you uncomfortable." She read the rest of the letter in silence, then set it down carefully on the table. "He also implies that you have a violent past, that you've hurt women before, that I should fear for my life." I felt something cold settle in my chest. "What do you believe?" She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes searching my face. "I believe," she said slowly, "that I have been living in your house for 3 weeks. I have seen you gentle, a spooked horse, with nothing but your voice. I have seen you carry baby chicks in hands that could crush stone and set them down without ruffling a feather. I have seen you lose your temper exactly once, when you hit your thumb with a hammer, and your response was to swear colorfully and then apologize to me for swearing in my presence." I didn't know what to say. No one had ever catalogued my better qualities like that before. No one had ever paid enough attention to notice them. "If you were the monster your cousin describes," Clara continued, "I would know it by now. I'm not a fool, Caleb, and I'm not easily frightened." Something loosened in my chest, a knot I hadn't known was there. "You believe me?" "I believe what I've seen with my own eyes." More letters came over the following weeks, each one a little more threatening than the last. Suggestions that I had a violent past. Hints that my mother's death hadn't been as peaceful as it seemed. Implications that marrying me had been the worst decision of Clara's life. Clara read them all, and then she did something that continually surprised me. She laughed. "These are pathetic," she said, dropping the latest letter on the table as if it were contaminated. "Is this really the best they can do?" Vague insinuations and poorly constructed threats. My late husband's creditors sent more intimidating letters, and they were just trying to collect money, not steal a fortune. They're trying to scare you away. Then they clearly don't know me very well. She met my eyes, and there was steel in her gaze, steel I was coming to recognize. "I made a deal with you, Caleb Harding. I don't break my deals." Something shifted in my chest, something warm. Something that felt dangerously like love. "Why?" I heard myself ask. "You could leave. Take what I've already given you and start over somewhere safe. No one would blame you. I wouldn't blame you. Why stay?" She was quiet for a long moment, and I watched her face, waiting for an answer I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. "Because I want to," she said finally, simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. I didn't know what to say to that. So I said nothing, just nodded and went back out to the fields and pretended I couldn't feel her eyes on my back as I walked away. The weeks passed, and my birthday grew closer. November bled into December, the fields turning white with frost, then with snow. Clara and I fell into a rhythm that was becoming harder and harder to call pretending. We ate our meals together, talking about everything and nothing. We worked side by side when the weather allowed it, her helping me with repairs and feeding the animals, me teaching her things about farming that I'd never thought I'd have anyone to share. We spent evenings by the fire, her reading, me working on small repairs or simply watching the flames, both of us comfortable in a silence that no longer felt empty. She was stronger than she looked, my Clara. Stubborn, too. When I tried to take the heavy work away from her, insisted she should stay warm inside. She refused, pointing out that she'd survived worse conditions with less help. When I worried about her catching cold, she reminded me that she was not made of glass, and that she'd managed to keep herself alive for 24 years before I came along. I was falling for her, falling hard and fast, and with no hope of stopping. Every day brought new reasons to love her, new glimpses of the woman she was beneath the careful exterior. But I kept my mouth shut, and I watched her from across rooms, and I counted down the days until I could fulfill my end of the bargain and set her free. Even if setting her free was the last thing in the world I wanted. The night of the attack, I was in the barn, checking on the mare that was due to foal any day. Old Bessie, we called her, though she wasn't that old really, just temperamental. She'd been my mother's horse before she died, and I'd kept her going long past, when a sensible farmer would have sent her to pasture. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the barn doors, whistling through cracks I needed to seal before the real winter storms hit. It was a bitter night, the kind of cold that made your bones ache, and I was looking forward to getting back inside, to the warmth of the fire, to Clara's quiet company. I almost didn't hear the wagon approaching until it was too late. Almost. Marcus's laugh was what alerted me, that cruel, confident laugh that had haunted my childhood, that had rung out every time he'd gotten away with something, every time he'd hurt someone smaller and weaker than himself. I'd know that laugh in the dark, in my sleep, in the depths of hell. I grabbed the pitchfork from where it leaned against the wall and moved toward the barn door. There were 3 of them. Marcus, small and rat-faced, his eyes glittering with malice in the lantern light. Elijah, built like a bull, his hand already on his pistol. And a 3rd man I didn't recognize, broad and mean-looking, with the dead eyes of someone who'd killed before and wouldn't mind doing it again. They were drunk, weaving slightly on their feet, but the guns in their hands were steady enough. Drunk men with guns were more dangerous than sober ones, less predictable, less willing to think about consequences. "Cousin," Marcus called out, his voice slurring only slightly, "we've come to give you one last chance. Your birthday's in 3 days. This game is almost over. Sign the land over to us tonight, and we'll let you and your pretty little wife ride off into the sunset. We'll even give you enough money to start over somewhere else. We're family, after all. Get off my land." Now, that's not very friendly. Elijah stepped forward, his pistol rising to point at my chest. "We're family, Caleb. Surely we can work something out, unless you'd rather do this the hard way." I thought about Clara in the house, probably asleep, unaware of the danger. I thought about what these men would do to her if I let them past me. They'd use her to get to me. They'd hurt her to break me. I knew them well enough to know that. I thought about every time Marcus had tormented me as a child, every cruel word, every petty cruelty. I thought about Elijah's cold eyes, about the men he'd been rumored to hire for jobs too dirty even for him. I thought about my father, about the land he'd left me, about the generations of work that would be wiped away if these men got what they wanted. And something inside me snapped. I don't remember the next few minutes clearly. Battle never works that way, at least not for me. Everything becomes sensation and instinct, thought dissolving into pure reaction. I remember throwing the pitchfork, hearing someone scream. I remember my fists connecting with flesh, bone cracking under my knuckles. I remember the 3rd man trying to run and catching him, and hitting him until he stopped moving. I remember Marcus's face, twisted with fear as I lifted him off his feet by his collar. "If you ever come near my wife again," I heard myself say, and my voice didn't sound like mine. It sounded like something ancient and terrible. "I will kill you. I will tear you apart with my bare hands and scatter the pieces across this county. Do you understand me?" He nodded frantically, tears streaming down his face. I threw him toward the wagon. "Get out! Take your brother and your hired thug and get out!" If I see any of you on my land again, I won't stop to talk first." They scrambled to obey, dragging Elijah's barely conscious form into the wagon, the third man limping behind. The horse bolted as soon as they were aboard, the wagon disappearing into the darkness. I stood there in the sudden silence, my chest heaving, my knuckles bleeding, my shirt torn. I was breathing like I'd run a mile. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, my throat, my fingertips. And then I heard a sound behind me and I turned. Clara was standing on the porch, a rifle in her hands, her nightgown glowing white in the lantern light from the windows. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, her hair loose around her shoulders. "I heard the noise," she said, her voice remarkably steady given the circumstances. "I thought, it's over." I started walking toward her, suddenly aware of how I must look. Wild, dangerous, covered in blood, some of it mine, most of it not. I looked like exactly the monster my cousins had described in their letters. But she didn't flinch. She didn't run. She didn't even step back. Instead, she set down the rifle, crossed the porch, walked down the steps, and came right into my arms. "You're hurt," she whispered, her fingers finding my bleeding knuckles in the darkness. "It's nothing." "It's not nothing." She pulled back, and even in the dim light, I could see the fear in her eyes. Not fear of me. Fear for me. "Come inside. Let me take care of you." I let her lead me into the house. I let her sit me down at the kitchen table, still warm from the banked fire. I let her clean my wounds with gentle hands, her brow furrowed in concentration, her touch so tender it made my chest ache. She didn't ask what had happened. She must have seen enough from the porch to know. She just worked in silence, cleaning and bandaging, her fingers careful on my battered skin. "You could have been killed," she said finally, not looking at me. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the tremor beneath it. They wouldn't have dared. "They brought guns, Caleb. They were drunk and angry, and they brought guns. They brought a man I've never seen before, a man who looked like he'd killed people for a living." She finally looked up, and her golden eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You could have died. I had something worth fighting for." Her hand stilled on mine. She looked up and our eyes met. "What do you mean?" I'd been holding this in for weeks, months maybe. Since the first night I'd seen her through that window, struggling under a load of linens, too proud to ask for help. Since she'd shaken my hand and agreed to pretend to be my wife. Since she'd walked into my life and set everything I thought I knew on fire. I'd promised her honesty. I'd promised her no games, no pretending. If either of us started to feel things that weren't part of the bargain, we would tell each other. I was done pretending. "I mean you," I said. "I mean that when I saw them coming, all I could think about was keeping you safe. I mean that somewhere in the last 2 months, you stopped being an arrangement and started being everything. I mean that I'm in love with you, Clara, completely and foolishly, and without any hope of going back." The words hung in the air between us. Clara's eyes widened, and I watched her face, waiting for the rejection I was sure would come. Waiting for her to remind me of our agreement, to tell me she didn't feel the same, to pull away and retreat back to the safety of separate bedrooms and careful distance. Instead, she reached up and touched my face. Her fingers traced the scar that ran from my temple to my jaw, the scar that made children stare and women look away, the scar that had been part of my ugliness for so long I'd forgotten it wasn't always there. She touched it like it was something precious. "Tell me," she whispered. "Tell me everything you feel." So I told her. I told her that I listened for her footsteps every morning, and that the sound of her voice was the best part of my day. I told her that I'd memorized the way she hummed when she worked, that I could probably recreate every song she'd ever sung under her breath. I told her that I'd started making up excuses to be in the house, just to hear that humming, just to be near her. I told her about standing in her doorway at night, watching her sleep, wishing I had the right to lie down beside her. I told her about the snake incident, about how holding her in my arms had felt like coming home, about how hard it had been to let go. I told her about every moment I'd wanted to kiss her, and hadn't. Every time I'd bitten my tongue to keep from saying something I couldn't take back. I told her that I didn't want to pretend anymore, that I wanted this to be real, that I wanted her, not as a business arrangement, not as a temporary solution, but as my wife, my partner, my love. When I finished, she was crying, tears rolling silently down her cheeks, her hand still pressed against my scarred face. "I thought I was going crazy," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought I was imagining things, the way you looked at me sometimes, like I was something precious. The way you'd find excuses to be near me, and then act like you didn't know why you were there. I told myself it was just wishful thinking." Wishful thinking? She smiled through her tears, a smile that transformed her whole face. "I've been falling in love with you for weeks, Caleb Harding. I think it started the night you killed that snake for me, when you held me like I mattered. Maybe it started before that. Maybe it started the day you asked me to marry you, when you were so nervous you couldn't stop turning your hat in your hands. I just didn't know how to tell you. I was afraid." I stared at her. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure she could hear it. "You love me. God help me, I do." She laughed, a watery sound that was half sob. "I love your awkwardness and your gentleness and the way you pretend to be gruff when you're actually the kindest man I've ever known. I love that you check on me every night. Yes, I know about that. I'm a light sleeper. I love that you treat me like an equal, not like a burden or a possession. I love." She trailed off, shaking her head. "I love you, all of you, even the parts you think are monstrous." I kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't planned. It was desperate and hungry and full of every feeling I'd been suppressing for weeks. Her hands fisted in my torn shirt, pulling me closer, heedless of the blood and dirt. I gathered her up like she weighed nothing at all, lifting her onto my lap, my arms wrapped around her like I'd never let go. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard. "What happens now?" she whispered. "Now," I said, pressing my forehead to hers, breathing in the scent of her, soap and lavender and something uniquely her. "We stop pretending." That night, Clara didn't go to her bedroom. She came to mine. I tried to be patient. I tried to go slow. But I'd been wanting her for so long, and she'd been wanting me, and the moment the door closed behind us, patience seemed like a distant, laughable concept. Still, I made myself stop at the edge of the bed, made myself look at her in the lamplight, this woman who had somehow become everything to me. She was still in her nightgown, white cotton that should have been modest but somehow wasn't, not with the way the firelight behind her turned it almost translucent. "We don't have to," I said, even though the words cost me everything. "If you're not ready, if you want to wait." "I'm ready." She stepped closer, her hands coming up to the buttons of my ruined shirt. "I've been ready. I've been waiting for you to see it." I let her undress me, her small fingers working the buttons loose, pushing the fabric off my shoulders. She studied my chest, the way she'd studied my face that first day, cataloguing every scar, every mark, every evidence of a hard life lived. Her fingers traced a pale line across my ribs, a souvenir from a knife fight in my 20s. "So many scars," she murmured. "Too many. Not too many." She looked up at me, her eyes dark with something I was only beginning to recognize as desire. "Every one of them is part of you, part of the man who saved me." She kissed the scar on my ribs, then one on my shoulder, then one on my chest, just above my heart. I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled her nightgown over her head in one motion, and then she was bare before me, all pale skin and soft curves and the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen in my life. She didn't try to hide from me, didn't shrink away or cover herself. She stood there and let me look my fill, her chin raised, her eyes steady. "You're beautiful," I said, and my voice came out rough, barely above a growl. "I don't have words for what you are." She smiled, a little uncertain. "Is that good?" I answered by pulling her against me. We fell onto the bed together, a tangle of limbs and sighs and whispered names. I touched her like she was made of glass, afraid of my own strength, afraid of wanting too much. But she pulled me closer, wrapped herself around me, showed me without words that I didn't have to be careful. "I'm not fragile," she breathed against my throat. "You won't break me." So I stopped holding back. I claimed her that night, gently at first, watching her face for any sign of discomfort, then with increasing urgency as her soft sounds encouraged me on. She surrendered to me completely, and in surrendering, she conquered me. She was my first, not in experience but in meaning. Every woman before her had been shadows, forgotten the moment they were gone. Clara burned herself into my soul. By the time dawn began to lighten the sky, we lay tangled together, spent and satisfied. Her head rested on my chest, her fingers tracing idle patterns on my skin. I could feel her heartbeat, slow and steady, matching the rhythm of my own. "Marry me," I said into her hair. She propped herself up, looking at me with sleepy, confused eyes. "We're already married. I want to do it again, properly, with a real proposal and a real celebration, and everyone knowing that you chose me. Not because of any bargain, not because of my father's will, just because you wanted to." She smiled, that smile that had been haunting my dreams for weeks. "Ask me properly, then." I sat up, tumbling her gently into the pillows, and took her hand in mine. Her fingers were so small against my palm, so delicate. How had I ever thought I could let her go? "Clara Whitmore Harding," I said, looking into her honey-gold eyes. "I love you. I love your stubbornness and your strength and the way you hum when you think no one is listening. I love that you're not afraid of me, even when you should be. I love that you came into my life as a stranger and became everything I never knew I needed. Will you stay with me? Not because of any bargain or arrangement, but because you want to? Will you be my wife, truly, for as long as we both shall live?" She was crying again, tears of joy this time, and she threw her arms around my neck. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." Oh, I spent the rest of the morning showing her just how happy her answer made me. My 35th birthday passed 3 days later, and with it, the threat of my cousin's claim. The land was mine, legally, and finally and forever. Marcus and Elijah had disappeared after the night of the attack, rumors placing them somewhere in Missouri, licking their wounds and nursing their grudges. I'd filed a report with the sheriff about the attack, and there were warrants out for their arrest, though I doubted they'd ever be served. Men like my cousins had a way of slipping through the cracks. I didn't care. They could run to the ends of the earth for all I minded. They could never hurt Clara again. That was all that mattered. We renewed our vows in the spring, in a ceremony that was everything the first one hadn't been. The church was full this time, packed with neighbors and townspeople who'd watched our story unfold. Clara wore white, a dress we'd ordered special from St. Louis, with lace at the collar and seed pearls sewn into the bodice. Her hair was down, the way I liked it, tumbling over her shoulders in dark waves. I wore a suit I'd had made in Wichita, dark blue wool that fit better than anything I'd ever owned. I'd even managed to get my hair to lie flat for once. Pastor Williams presided again, but this time he was smiling. The whole town was smiling. They'd watched our unlikely romance from the beginning, had seen us transform from strangers to partners to something deeper. Today, they got to see it made official. "I do," Clara said, and this time, her voice rang out clear and strong, meant to be heard by everyone. "I do," I echoed, and I meant every word with my whole heart. When Pastor Williams told me I could kiss my bride, I didn't hesitate this time. I pulled Clara into my arms and kissed her like she was the air I needed to breathe, like she was the sun I'd been living without, like she was everything good in the world gathered into one small, perfect woman. The church erupted in applause. Someone whistled. Old Tom Fletcher shouted something inappropriate that made the ladies gasp and the men laugh. I didn't care about any of it. I only cared about the woman in my arms, my wife, my love, my home. The summer that followed was the happiest of my life. Clara bloomed like the wildflowers that covered our fields, growing more beautiful with each passing day. We worked side by side under the hot Kansas sun, and I taught her everything I knew about wheat farming, about reading the weather, about coaxing life from stubborn soil. She was a quick learner, picking up skills I'd spent years developing, and she had ideas of her own, innovations that made me wonder why I'd never thought of them myself. We built something together that summer. Not just the farm, though we did improve that, adding a new barn and expanding the chicken coop, and finally fixing that leak in the kitchen roof I'd been meaning to get to for 5 years. We built a partnership, a life. A future neither of us had dared to dream about. The day Clara told me she was carrying my child was the day I learned what true happiness meant. We were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, paint the wheat fields gold, the sky streaked with pink and orange and purple. The heat of the day was finally fading, and a cool breeze had sprung up from the west, carrying the scent of the river. It was my favorite time of day, the space between work and rest, and I usually spent it in comfortable silence. But Clara was fidgeting. I'd noticed it all day, a nervous energy that wasn't like her. She'd started sentences and not finished them, had drifted off in the middle of tasks, had looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Finally, as the sun touched the horizon, she took my hand and pressed it to her stomach. "There's going to be 3 of us soon," she said softly. I didn't understand at first. My mind was on the farm, on the harvest coming up, on the new equipment I'd been meaning to order. And then her words filtered through, and the meaning hit me like a thunderbolt. I dropped to my knees in front of her, my hands shaking, my eyes burning with tears I refused to let fall. I pressed my face to her belly, this small, flat space that held our future, and I wept. "A baby," I managed to say. "Our baby. Are you happy?" I looked up at her, this woman who had come into my life as a business arrangement and become my everything. Her eyes were anxious, searching my face for reassurance. I didn't know it was possible to be this happy. She smiled, threading her fingers through my hair. Neither did I. The years that followed were the best of my life. I watched Clara's belly swell with our first child, watched her waddle around the house in her later months, complaining about swollen ankles and strange cravings and the baby's tendency to kick at 3 in the morning. I rubbed her feet and made her tea and held her hair back when the morning sickness struck. I did everything I could think of to make her comfortable, to show her how much she meant to me. Our son was born on a cold January night, with the wind howling outside and the midwife rushing to get there in time. I held Clara's hand through the whole thing, feeling helpless and terrified and more in love than I'd ever thought possible. And when the baby finally came, red-faced and screaming, perfect in every way, I held him in my massive arms and marveled at how something so small could hold so much of my heart. We named him William, after Clara's father, who had died when she was young, before she ever had a chance to really know him. He had my dark hair and Clara's golden eyes, and he had a grip that would have done a farmhand proud. I'd been so afraid I wouldn't know how to be a father. My own father had been cold, distant, more interested in the land than in the boy who would inherit it. I'd had no model for warmth, no example of tenderness. But when I held William, when I looked into his tiny face, the fear disappeared. I knew exactly what kind of father I wanted to be. I wanted to be the opposite of mine. 2 years later, our daughter was born. We named her Sarah, and she had her mother's fire and her father's stubbornness, a combination that would give us grey hairs before we were 50. She was beautiful and fierce and utterly impossible, and I was wrapped around her tiny finger from the moment she drew her first breath. Our home filled with laughter and chaos and love. The silence that had haunted me for so many years was banished forever, replaced by the sounds of children running through rooms, of bedtime stories and nursery rhymes, of Clara humming as she cooked dinner while a toddler clung to her skirts. Sometimes, late at night, when the children were sleeping and the house was quiet, Clara would find me on the porch, staring out at the land that had almost cost me everything. "What are you thinking about?" she would ask, settling into my arms like she'd always belonged there. "I'm thinking about how different my life would have been if you'd said no. What would you have done?" Probably married Mrs. McAllister, lived a loveless life, died bitter and alone, just like my father. She would laugh at that, swatting my chest, and I would pull her closer and breathe in the scent of her hair and thank whatever force in the universe had brought her to my door. "I'm glad I said yes," she would whisper. "So am I." The years have only deepened what we have. We've weathered storms, both literal and metaphorical. We've buried loved ones and welcomed new ones. We've watched our children grow and find their own paths, and we've grown old together, side by side, just as we always intended. My hands are gnarled now, roughened by decades of work, but they still fit perfectly around Clara's. My hair has gone grey, and my back aches on cold mornings, but I still wake every day grateful for the woman beside me. If you had asked me, that cold October evening in 1895, what I was willing to trade for my land, I would have said anything, everything. I didn't know then that the trade would bring me so much more than I bargained for. I asked Clara to pretend to be my wife. She became the love of my life. I asked for 6 weeks of an arrangement. She gave me a lifetime of happiness. I asked for a stranger's help. She became my partner, my lover, my best friend, my home. And that, my friends, is how a desperate rancher and a broken widow became the most unexpected love story in Flint Creek, Kansas. And that's how a stranger became my everything. If this story touched your heart, leave a like. Subscribe. I have more tales waiting for you. Until next time.